All right, welcome to another review session for AP Euro. Today we're going to look at 3.3 through 3.5 on the course description that you can find through AP Classroom. Now, a little note, I'm actually going to start with 3.5 and work my way back to 3.3 after this. The reason why, it's 3.5 deals with the Dutch Golden Age. And the Dutch Golden Age comes about because of the Netherlands breaking away successfully from the Spanish Habsburgs, and it's tied into political things. The Dutch are the second state, besides the British, to develop a political model that is different than absolute monarchy. And really, I probably should have done this yesterday in the video, but we'll just talk about it now. So the big picture thing you want to focus on when you look at the golden age of Netherlands is, as it says right here, explain the factors that contributed to the development of the Dutch Republic. So we want to look at causes. Why did the Dutch Golden Age happen? How do we see the formation of the Dutch Republic? And basically, the independence of the Netherlands comes about because of the heavy-handed religious and political policies of the Spanish Habsburgs, particularly Philip II, the King of Spain, right at the beginning of the 1600s. And so the Dutch sort of had a history of relative decentralized power where, different sections participated in sort of republican sort of government. But what the Spanish want to do is impose strict monarchical control over everything that's going on within all their lands. And so the Spanish try to impose strong, centralized, absolute monarchy on their Dutch citizens. In addition, Spain is incredibly strict about Catholicism being the only religion that is allowed to be practiced in their lands. And of course, the Dutch are going to be mostly Calvinist. The major Christian institution there is the Dutch Reformed Church, but they have a more religiously tolerant sort of attitude that we are going to see, and that will conflict with this as well. So we've got Dutch rejection of centralized government, strong monarchical control, and we've got Dutch Protestantism versus Spanish Catholicism being a major reason for the split that happens here. Now, the effects of that split is that the Netherlands is going to become a republic, like it says, but more importantly, a great economic power. The 17th century, the 1600s, sees the rise of the Dutch as like the preeminent economy of this time period. All right, and so what we are going to see is that there is going to be a real big focus on developing trade and contact with the outside world, and the Dutch are going to invest heavily in their merchant marine. They're going to have great ships that are fast, that can access areas of the global trade network that others can't, and they're really going to promote the development of sort of capitalist pursuit of profit and things like that. So let's take a picture of this map right here. So in the 1648 to 1815 time period, a continuation we see is the increasingly European-dominated global trade network that is forming. We're going to come back to this map a couple of times. For right now, we want to look in this area right here. In green, you can see that represents Dutch control, and these green trade routes are Dutch trade routes. And the Dutch are going to grow very wealthy from their ability to control the spice trade in the Indian Ocean. And so that is going to make them very wealthy, very prosperous. Now, in addition to that great economic prosperity, the Dutch Golden Age is going to also have artistic ramifications from that. Let's see if I can get to this. And so the Dutch Golden Age is not just about economics and business, but it's also about art as well. Now, the Dutch Golden Age is going to be the time of Baroque art. Baroque art was used strongly by the Catholic Church in places like Spain, with artists like Peter Paul Rubens to create artwork for Catholic churches. That's not what it's going to look like in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is going to show things like this, right? Which, let me move my face here, is still life, right? They're going to show secular subjects. They're going to show scenes from everyday life. We're not going to see a lot of religious things, because that was one of the criticisms of the Catholic Church: too ostentatious, too ornate, too interested in trying to show glamour and power and things like that. So we'll see still life, or we'll see scenes of everyday life of working women, or we'll see self-portraits. This here is Rembrandt. He is the most famous Dutch artist during this particular time period. Other things that we see, here's another still life image. Other things that we'll see, where'd it go? I'm just gonna keep scrolling because, ships going into port, because, right, trade, global trade is a major thing. And then we'll see things like port scenes and the canals of Amsterdam, various stuff like that, right? So this is what we see here. Now we will also see the influence of Calvinism on Dutch architecture. This is a Dutch Reformed church. Notice how simple and austere on the outside it is compared to the great Baroque cathedrals the Catholic Church is having built at this time, like St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And then the interior is much more austere, very little decoration, no gold, no stained glass windows for the most part, no crazy works of art to like inspire you, just simple, humble prayer and worship that shows the real Calvinist influence on the Netherlands. So that is basically all we need to say for the Dutch Golden Age, right? The things that it represents, or the things that are key features of it: economic prosperity, participation in global trade, a flourishing in the arts that we see, and then the development of relative religious tolerance in society, but also a limitation on what governmental power is, a zig where the rest of Europe is zagging to absolute monarchy. Okay, so now let's back up and go to 3.3. So 3.3 and 3.4 share something very much in common. They are going to be about economic policies and development and practices during this time period. What does economics look like in the age of absolutism? What sort of economic activities do we see happening from 1648 until 1815? Now, these are going to be mostly things that are pre-industrial, but they are going to lead to the Industrial Revolution in the next time period when it really gets going. All right, so big picture for 3.3 is a change in continuity, right? What are the changes and continuities to the economic system in Europe from 1648 to 1815? A lot of changes. But the 3.3 is going to deal mostly with change or continuity within European societies, right? Particularly the role that greater capitalist practices have on European society. All right, so the first one is an agricultural revolution takes place in the 1648 to 1815 time period. Now, we briefly talked about this last time when we were talking about how agriculture became increasingly influenced by market pressures and forces, that basically capitalism was coming to the agricultural realm of the economy. That will only continue during this time. In the 1700s, because of the influence of the scientific revolution, we will see greater emphasis on scientific farming practices, things like the enclosure movements, where large landowners would fence off their land and no longer allow for common pasturage and things like that. The planting of turnips, and instead of letting fields just lay fallow. The reclamation of land and turning it into usable agricultural territory. The other one was selective breeding of livestock to produce bigger and hardier animals. All of these things are going to incentivize landowners to invest in their farms to get greater profit from them. And it is also going to be aided by the fact that European population will grow steadily in the 1700s, raising the prices of agricultural products. So that's the first thing. Obviously, this is a big change that we see. Second thing with agriculture is that the importation of New World foodstuff like corn, like the potato, is going to lead to a greater amount of food available, which will lead to rising population, right? So the 1700s is a time of rising population and the introduction of new foodstuffs from new markets that the global trade network is establishing. All right. Labor and trade during this time period, 1648 to 1815, will see themselves freed from institutions or traditional practices that had limited trade in the earlier time period. The most obvious example of this is going to be governments are going to find that there are going to be restrictions about how they can tax and how they have to treat property, right? So there is this development of the idea of like private property, and then an individual should be able to do whatever they want with their own property or capital. And then there is also going to be a tax on the guild system. Now, for those who don't remember, the guild system was around in the Middle Ages and the early modern European time. It is where it limited the number of people who could do a particular trade to protect the workers of that trade. And so if you were going to, I don't know, be a cobbler, make shoes, you had to join the guild. You would start as an apprentice and learn the tricks of the trade. And then maybe you could be a journeyman. And eventually, if you were good enough, you might be able to open up your own shop. But it limited who could do that. And the guilds were protected by city laws. But what we are going to see in this time, as liberal economic philosophers like Adam Smith in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, they're going to argue that guilds are repressive and restrictive and that they limit production. And as population grows and demand for goods increase, we are going to see entrepreneurs and businessmen are going to invest in new strategies and new techniques to meet that growing demand. So we will see labor and trade freed from traditional restrictions, government, guild organizations, and then also churches are going to lose their ability to limit business activities. The Catholic Church in particular had rules about lending money at interest and various other business practices. But as the Protestant Reformation hurts the Catholic Church, as religious authority is begun to be challenged, and as kings take on more of a role, there'll be less religious restrictions on what can be done as well. All right. Now, the best example of this that we are talking about is the formation of what is known as the putting out system or the cottage industry. You should know both of those terms because they both show up in the course description. Putting out system or cottage industry is basically where entrepreneurs would gain access to raw materials, usually from global trade networks. Now, traditionally, the guild would have been responsible for taking those raw materials and turning them into usable manufactured goods. But what these entrepreneurs are going to do is that instead of using the guilds, they're going to go around the guild system and have individuals in their homes utilizing machines in their homes, or just their hands. Starts with their hands, later on with machines, and turn those raw materials into usable manufactured goods. That's why it's called the putting out system, because it's going outside of the guilds. Also, it's why it's called the cottage industry, because it is business being conducted in private homes. Now, eventually, the cottage industry will give way to the factory system, but we'll need James Watt and the steam engine to change that. And we will see the beginnings of industrialization at the end of this time period, but it's really going to gather steam in the 19th century. But that is the most significant thing that we see in terms of like challenging the traditional way in which business is conducted and things like that. All right, so as the market economy flourishes, as capitalism becomes a bigger and bigger feature of European economics, new financial institutions, new financial practices will emerge that are going to have profound impacts, right? The creation of a banking system. Now, there had always been banks, but they're going to become ever more important in European activities. We're going to see that banks are vital for complex financial transactions, establishing lines of credit so people can take out loans and invest in developed businesses. What today we might call venture capitalism. Venture capitalism is where a person who has extra capital listens to ideas from businessmen and decides if he is going to invest in those businesses or not. Think about the TV show Shark Tank. For those of you who are familiar with that show, that is what venture capitalism is. We're also going to see the creation of insurance companies. The creation of insurance is a combination of like capitalist forces looking for ways to use your own capital to make profit, and scientific revolution, and now they can calculate risk. Okay, so we will protect your business from these sorts of things if you pay a premium of, X dollars a month. And it offers protection to the businessman. It also is a way for a person who has money to make more money because, the hope of an insurance company is that they never have to pay any claims. And then you have new conceptions of property rights. We've already talked about this idea that private property is an essential right, that I should be able to do whatever I want with my property, with my capital, is going to become deeply rooted, especially in liberal economic philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and Adam Smith during this time. And then joint stock companies, kind of like venture capitalism, right? Investing in businesses oftentimes that are involved in global trade or are bringing in items from somewhere else in the world. And so we'll see the rise of the stock market and investing, stuff like that. Just an increasingly complex financial economy with complex financial transactions is going to change the way in which Europe does business. The last thing, talking about internal European economies, is that this market economy, this focus on capitalism, is going to allow for Europe to continue to grow ever more powerful, and they're going to come to dominate the growing trade network that is happening on a global scale more and more so, right? We are going to see the Europeans are going to bring in goods and items from all over the world, and they're really going to be the leaders of that sort of thing. And the capitalist policies are going to enable that to take place. Okay, so that is 3.3. Now let us look at 3.4, and we'll just look at the course description to see what exactly they want us to talk about there. Economic development and mercantilism. So in the last topic, we sort of looked at how capitalism transformed European societies. Now we're going to look at how mercantilism transforms European societies. But the key thing here is that capitalism is done within European societies. Mercantilism is imposed by Europeans on their New World colonies. That's the key difference there. So now we're going to look more at like what effect did the Europeans and their policies have on places outside of Europe, and also how do those policies affect Europe as well. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at is the European domination of the global trade network, right? And the European domination of the global trade network is going to lead to what College Board terms in its course description as revolutions in agriculture, industry, and consumerism. And so basically the growing trade network, the global trade network that exists, is going to transform European societies. It will change what goods are farmed and how farming practices happen. Obviously, it's going to change how businesses work. We just got done talking about the putting out system. That's tied directly to the availability of raw materials, textiles from the global trade network. And it's going to create a more consumer-oriented society. So it really transforms European society. That's the key point here. All right, so the first thing that we're going to see is the implementation of mercantilism, especially in the New World colonies, the promotion of cash crops and plantation economies to produce goods that Europeans desire. Cash crops like sugar and tobacco are going to become highly desired by Europeans, and many places in the New World will specialize their economies to produce those goods. We will also see limitations placed upon the colonies. A Spanish colony is only allowed to trade with Spain. They're not even allowed to trade with one another. The Spanish are going to control all aspects of trade. The British and the French will impose similar limitations in their colonies. And the colonies will also be restricted as to what they can produce. They are not going to be allowed to create industries that compete with the mother country. And so there is a lot of economic control placed upon these colonies in the New World. Now, one of the big features of the mercantile economies of the New World is the use of coerced labor or slavery. The slave trade is going to grow ever larger during this time. It had started in the 1500s, it grows in the 1600s, it grows in the 1700s, right? Slavery and the demand for slavery is going to just be something that always increases. And so some terms you should be familiar with, and let's go back to that map now, let's see, where's that at? Here it is. Uh-oh, I lost the map. There it is the Middle Passage, which describes the passage for African slaves going from Africa to the New World, usually either Brazil or the Caribbean plantations. And then that's part of the Triangle Trade Network, the triangle, you can't see my finger, the triangle that forms between Europeans taking guns and manufactured goods to Africa, dropping them off, picking up slaves, shipping slaves to the New World, and then shipping the raw materials and other products back to European markets, right? Key feature of the global trade network that we see at this time. And obviously you can see with this map, the Spanish are the dominant power when it comes to that. Britain, France, and the Netherlands will be a little bit later on, but eventually their economies are going to be stronger than the Spanish. The Spanish, they are going to grow very wealthy from silver extraction, but they never develop a commercial economy. They kind of stick with a traditional economy based on land ownership. They don't have a strong entrepreneurial spirit, and so they will lose out as Britain and the Netherlands and France gains. All right. Consumerism. So these new trading connections introduce Europeans to goods from all over the world. Prior to the global trade network being established, life in what we call the old regime was one of scarcity. There wasn't enough stuff for everyone to have lots of things. There was just this accepted lack of. But what we are going to see with the creation of a global trade network is an influx of goods that is going to filter down throughout society, and more people are going to have more, and this is a very technical term, stuff. There's just more stuff available for people. And so life is going to begin to be measured by the amount of commercial goods that you have. Now, another thing that is going to happen, as we talked about, is the growing population, because of better farming practices, because of new world foodstuffs, leads to more people. The old ways of producing things can't keep up with that population growth. There's a demand for consumer goods that will lead some enterprising entrepreneurs to experiment with production techniques, the putting out system, eventually the creation of machines, the steam engine, industrialization, mass production, all those sorts of things. So here is another thing about consumerism, is that is the quality of one's life supposed to be measured by the amount of consumer goods that they have? Does stuff make your life good? Now, of course, this is a philosophical question, and we could argue this back and forth. What's inarguable, though, is that this is going to become the definition of what it means to have a good life in Western society up till this present day, right? So the development of a consumer-oriented society. Now, of course, industrialization and its mass production is going to, zoom this into overdrive when we get to the 19th century, but it has its roots in the 17th and 18th century from global trade. The fourth point they want you to know about the mercantile economies: the increased supply of New World food leads to increased population. And then the commercial growth that we are seeing is fueled by. So European economies are going to grow because of the raw materials that are available that they can use to create new businesses, the finished products that can make their lives better, the markets that are now opened up for them to sell goods and interact in trade, and the availability of labor that their economies are going to be dependent upon, right? And so basically what this is saying is that the global economy, the global trade network that the Europeans come to dominate, is going to lead to considerable commercial and industrial growth within European societies. They are really going to benefit from this, economically speaking. All right. And again, The rising population, because of New World food, because of new agricultural techniques, is going to put strains on the old means of production. The guilds can't keep up, so now we have the putting out system. Making stuff in the cottage industry can't keep up, so now we have factories, right? You can see the progression that we are making towards industrialization. Not really there at the end of this time period, but it will come quickly in the next time period. Okay, that's all for today. Hopefully you enjoyed what we had to talk about. Until next time, I'll see you later.